when the nations of the world went back to Rio in June of this past year, it was very clear that collectively the nations of the planet had actually failed to address the environmental challenges at the scale and with the urgency they deserve. And that is still true today, and nothing sort of sums it up more effectively than this diagram produced by Johan Rockström and colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute, which talks about or displays planetary boundaries. So anything which is beyond the green in the center is some major environmental issue which has transgressed a planetary boundary. And on the right you can see the nitrogen cycle, which represents the fact that there is now twice as much biologically active nitrogen in the world as in pre-industrial times. Climate change towards the top is actually, in my view, underestimated, and I think you will understand that by the end of this talk. And biodiversity loss is by far the greatest excursion beyond planetary boundaries. And that is simply because all environmental problems affect living systems. Therefore, biodiversity integrates all environmental problems. So beyond being a problem in itself, it presents a picture of the state of the environment as a whole. So this afternoon, I will concentrate primarily on the linkages between biodiversity and climate change, which are both negative and positive. In 1896, when the Swedish scientist Arrhenius published a very famous paper, he was actually asking a very important question. Why is the planet a habitable temperature for humans and other forms of life? Why isn't it too cold? And the answer, of course, was the greenhouse effect and the presence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And incidentally, he managed to calculate with pencil and paper what doubling pre-industrial levels of CO2 would do to the average temperature of the Earth. And it came out almost precisely where the modern supercomputer models project the temperature would be. What Arrhenius did not know was any detail of the history of the temperature of the planet in the last tens and hundreds of thousands of years. And in particular, that in the last 10,000 years, which you see on the upper right in this graph, that the climate of the Earth had been unusually stable. And that 10,000 years includes all recorded human history, a significant portion of unrecorded human history. It includes the origins of agriculture. It includes the origin of human settlements. It basically makes the point that the entire human enterprise is based on the assumption of a stable climate. In those same 10,000 years, all ecosystems have been adjusting to a stable climate. And that, of course, is changing because of the addition of greenhouse gases through human activity. And the Earth's climate system has already begun to respond. The Earth is now about 0.8 to 0.9 degrees warmer than in pre-industrial times. And we continue to add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere at a rate worse than the worst-case projection scenario of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I want to talk about how the planet is responding to that climate change and how it might respond, and in the end, how we might manage the planet to achieve a much more desirable and sustainable outcome for humanity. So, of course, there are changes in the physical aspects of nature, in particular between the liquid and solid phases of water. So here you're looking at the annual expansion and contraction of ice on the Arctic Ocean, which, as you can see, has been diminishing at quite a rapid rate and continues to do so. Lakes are freezing later in the autumn in the northern hemisphere. The ice is breaking up earlier in the spring. Glaciers are in retreat in most parts of the world. Here we're looking at Glacier National Park in the northwest United States, which soon will be a glacier national park only in name. And in the tropics, where there are glaciers on the top of high mountains like here in Kilimanjaro, all tropical glaciers are retreating at a rate that they will be gone within 15 years. Other physical changes include the rise of sea level. Initially, that was through the thermal expansion of water responding to the warmer temperatures, but now it includes the addition of melt from glaciers on land. And I cannot help but note that 3 generations back, my great-grandfather chaired the commission that designed the New York subway system. Obviously, he did not know that sea level would already be half a meter higher in and around Manhattan, or that there would be things like climate change fueling more intense tropical storms. But the result we know, we've been reading about in the last days. So on the eastern shore of the state of Maryland, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, through a combination of natural subsidence of the land and sea level rise, is well on its way to becoming a marine refuge. And I've already referred to the probable increased frequency of more intense tropical cyclones. The science on that is not entirely nailed down yet, but every indication is that it is headed in that direction. There is absolutely no question about the increase of the incidence of wildfire in the western United States. In the United States, we read about that every summer, see it on television every summer. But the rest of what I want to talk is how the biology of the planet is responding to the climate change that has already taken place. So in New England, lilacs are blooming earlier in the spring. At the Royal Botanic Garden, at Kew, outside of London, a whole series of flowering plants have earlier flowering times. And it is not just plants that have been changing their annual life cycles, but also animals. So in the United States, tree swallows are migrating earlier, nesting earlier, and laying eggs earlier, and even a couple of species of migratory birds have ceased to migrate. And more important, we are beginning to see species change where they live. So this butterfly, the Aedes checker spot, is one of the 2 best studied butterfly species in all of North America, and it has been clearly moving northward and upward in altitude in search of its desired climatic conditions. In Yosemite National Park, in the Sierra Nevada, the snow now only falls down to about 3,500 feet above sea level, whereas 20 or 30 years ago it fell to about 2,200 feet. And the ponderosa pine, which depends on winter snowpack, is now dying out in a belt between those two altitudes. Elsewhere in California, the Joshua Tree is literally moving outside of the Joshua Tree National Park. And the National Arbor Day Foundation, which is basically an organization for people who love to plant trees, literally found it necessary to produce a new map to guide people as to which species they are likely to be successful planting where they live. So the changes are not occurring just on land, they're also occurring in the oceans. So plankton species are changing their distributions, fish species are changing their distributions. In the Chesapeake Bay, the eelgrass communities turn out to be quite sensitive to temperature. There is an upper temperature beyond which eelgrass will not grow. So the southern boundary of the eelgrass communities in the Chesapeake Bay have been moving northward year after year. And the changes we're seeing are not just in the Arctic or in the temperate zone, we're also seeing changes in the tropics. This is the legendary cloud forest of Monteverde in Costa Rica. It is an ecosystem that depends almost entirely on condensation from clouds as the source of its moisture. And Monteverde is experiencing increasing numbers of dry days because the clouds are now forming at a higher altitude with greater frequency than previously. It is not a good outlook for the Monteverde cloud forest. We're also seeing what are called decoupling events, where two features in nature that have been tightly linked have actually been driven by two different timing mechanisms, one depending on temperature, the other depending on day length. And so we are now finding the snowshoe hare exquisitely adapted to be hard to find with its white fur in winter, carrying that white fur into times in the spring beyond which snow is no longer around to camouflage it. So it is being subjected to much higher rates of predation. On the north shore of Alaska, the seabird called the black guillemot has its nesting sites, and the adult birds fly from the nests all the way to the edge of the ice to feed and bring back food for the young in their nests. And that has become a longer and longer journey for the adult birds to make every year, and so at least one of those nesting colonies has already failed. And this completely incomprehensible slide, which I would actually mark down one of my students if they produced it in a talk, is actually to make the point that what I've just been describing to you is no longer individual examples or anecdotes. It is statistically robust that nature is on the move almost anywhere one looks in the world. So the much more important question is, what does it look like looking ahead? What we've seen so far are really minor ripples in the fabric of nature. So what does it look like looking ahead? So one thing one can do to try and get a sense of where things might go and look like in the future is to actually look at the climatic conditions within which a species occurs today, and then look where the global climatic models say such conditions will exist in the future. So the sugar maple, such an iconic species in North America, according to all 5 major computer models, the sugar maple will no longer occur in the northeastern United States, and anybody who wishes to enjoy the brilliant autumn foliage created by sugar maples or maple sugar or maple syrup will have to go to Canada. Similar kinds of projections have been made looking at tree species in Europe. But one of the really important points to make here is it's not just temperature that will be changing. Climate includes more than temperature. It also includes moisture and precipitation. So for any terrestrial organism, the 2 most important physical factors are temperature and moisture. And for any aquatic organism, the 2 most important factors are temperature and pH or acidity. And all of those are changing. And the kinds of changes we're seeing are also interacting with other kinds of human generated changes. So in Lake Chad, climate-driven drought is interacting with human-driven land use change, such that Lake Chad is now literally 5% in size of the size it was 35 years ago. Freshwater ecosystems and freshwater species will be affected, particularly species like trout, which are adapted to cold water, and species which live in high places like this charming little relative of the rabbits, the American pika. The pika lives in the Rocky Mountains in a series of isolated populations at high elevations. It's got a fascinating biology, which I don't have time to describe to you, but the point is that for species like the American pika, they will move upward trying to track their climatic conditions until ultimately there is no farther up for them to go. So species which live in high places are, as a group, particularly vulnerable. And this will give you a sense of what temperature change increase will do for the bird and mammal species of the rainforests of Queensland in Australia. The darker the red, the more of those species exist. So you can see with increasing climate change, the Queensland rainforests become less and less hospitable to the species which they're characteristically home for. Species which live in coastal regions obviously are going to have to cope with sea level rise. Some will do better than others. But species on islands, just like species in high places, are also particularly vulnerable, especially low-lying islands like the Florida Keys, home to the key deer, eventually will disappear with sea level rise. But even on islands which are high enough to still be in existence with sea level rise, the climate will in fact be changing, and there's no way that the species can move to track their required climatic conditions. And of course, species which have natural histories very closely related to ice will be particularly vulnerable. And we all know that the polar bear is essentially the poster child for all those species. So as one looks ahead with increasing climate change, there are some very substantial complications. And the first of these deals with what we've mostly done to landscapes almost everywhere humans exist. So we all know that glaciers came and went in the northern hemisphere without great apparent loss of biological diversity. But the big difference between that time and where we're headed is what we have done to landscapes, taking what had been continuous habitat, as in this township in Wisconsin in the upper left, and reducing it for various human purposes to isolated fragments until ultimately it looks like something in the lower right. And the problem with all this habitat fragmentation and heavy modification of the landscape is that as plant and animal species attempt to move to track their required climatic conditions, we have essentially set up these landscapes as obstacle courses. So this complication is an easy one to address. Just try and put connections back between isolated bits of nature to make it easier for the species to move around. Second complication is a more difficult one. And we know from studies of species responses to climate change in the past that ecosystems actually don't move as ecosystems. What happens is that individual species move, each in their own particular direction and at their own particular rate. And the result is, if we have that much climate change, that the species will move and the ecosystems that we know will disassemble in the process, and the surviving species will ultimately reassemble into new ecosystems which are extremely difficult for us to even imagine in advance. So what we're looking at here is what happened after the retreat of the last glacier in Europe. We're looking at 3 mammal species and 2 tree species and 1 insect species, and it's pretty apparent that the dispersal response and patterns are quite different. So that's a very serious complication. Third complication is, despite the way we tend to look at things through computer models in which change is linear and gradual, we know, in fact, that the climate system historically has not worked that way. So we know, for example, that the global conveyor belt, which moves warmth around the oceans of the globe as a major driver of climate, has been known to shut down in the past. Are we seeing any early indications of that? It's really hard to tell. But what we're also seeing, we're seeing abrupt changes in ecosystems. And in Western North America, the coniferous forests are showing the impact of climate change because the native bark beetles are encountering milder winters, so more overwinter, and longer summers, so they get in an extra generation. And right now you're just seeing little pinpricks of outbreak in the early 70s, but by the mid-80s, it's already a much greater impact. And even after a cold winter in 1985, you'll see this simulation of the situation in British Columbia that a lot more beetles overwinter. And so literally, whether you're looking at southern Colorado or southern Alaska or British Columbia, up to 70% of the coniferous trees are dead. So that is a major abrupt change in ecosystems that we're already seeing at 0.8 to 0.9 degrees. Another one of the abrupt changes we're seeing is in tropical coral reefs, which all look like this when I was a graduate student. Amazing technicolor worlds of high diversity and productivity and benefit to local communities. But not a great deal of elevated temperature for not a very long period of time will actually causes the fundamental partnership of a coral reef to break down. And the coral animal literally ejects its algal partner. And then what occurs is what's called a bleaching event. And basically, the ecosystem goes from technicolor to black and white, the diversity crashes, the productivity crashes, and the benefit to local communities crash. And 1/12 of humanity depends for their well-being on tropical coral reefs. So we're also seeing larger scale change, and we're seeing hints of it in terms of how moisture is fed into the Amazon basin. As you look on the right-hand side of this image of how moisture is generated and moves around the world, you can see moisture coming off the tropical Atlantic into the Amazon and how it is recycled as the air mass moves across the Amazon and finally hits the Andes, causing a lot of rain in the Amazon River system and some moisture going north and south to create rain, including to the Brazilian major agricultural area. So it's been obvious from the beginning that too much deforestation might undercut that hydrological cycle. And what we are beginning to see is maybe previews of what climate change may bring to the Amazon. 2005 was the greatest recorded drought in history in the Amazon, surpassed by an even greater drought in 2010. And the combination of fire, deforestation, and climate change looks like it is very close to a point where it could cause dieback in the Amazon, where the southern and eastern forests would die back and be replaced by some kind of savanna vegetation. Obviously, with a great loss of biological diversity, impact on the people of the region, and essentially a change in regional climate. So we're clearly working up to a point where climate change is working and playing with critical thresholds in the Earth system, ones that we don't understand well, but we certainly know enough to know we should not be trying to pass. So another system change is involved the oceans, and basically for years scientists were delighted by the amount of excess CO2 the oceans absorbed, and it wasn't until 2005 that somebody actually stopped to think what simple high school chemistry would have told us from the beginning, which is that some of that CO2 is converted into carbonic acid. So the oceans are now 30% more acid than in pre-industrial times, and that's of particular significance for the tens of thousands of species that build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. Basically, the colder the water is and the more acid it is, the harder it is for those species to build their shells. And it includes a lot of species we know very well, and then a lot of little ones like the sea butterfly, which exists in untold numbers and are actually the base of the food chain in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. And this is one of these little sea butterflies. It's actually a tiny little snail with its foot modified to serve as wings to keep it in the food column. So effects are already beginning to be seen, not in major ways, but in minor ways at the base of the food chain in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. And this, I'll just take you through what increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere will mean in terms of the future for tropical coral reefs. Pay attention to the little graph at the top, and you'll see that the reefs move into less and less favorable conditions. So 380 is a little bit below where we are today. This is what the negotiations are about stopping at. And this is what doubling pre-industrial levels of CO2 would do. So this brings me to sort of the final part of this talk. And that is to basically make the case that the target of the climate negotiations to try and stop at 2 degrees is actually a mistaken target, that 2 degrees is too much. We know from looking at the conditions of the Greenland ice sheet and some other things that 2 degrees is probably too much for that. We certainly know it is a serious situation for major ecosystems like tropical coral reefs and others that we're just beginning to see changes in. So one could be very simple-minded about it and just say, you know, the last time the Earth was 2 degrees warmer, sea levels was 4 to 6 meters higher. There's absolutely no question about that. I mean, what more do we need to know? So between sea level rise, the conditions of global ice and ecosystems, 2 degrees really is too much. And this is just the conclusions of a Royal Society meeting, just basically saying that tropical coral reefs cannot exist above 350 parts per million. So some of us who are looking at this situation think that what we really need to do is get back to a safer level, perhaps 350 parts per million. And the big problem here is that if we want to stop at 2 degrees, global emissions have to peak in 2016. So is it all over for ecosystems and all over in terms of that sea level rise? Happily, the answer to that is no. There are things that can be done. So here is Dr. Planet. He's looked at this situation, diagnosed what's going on, and he's about to make some prescriptions. And some involve revising conservation strategies. Others deal with limiting greenhouse gas concentrations by limiting emissions. So there are obvious ones like putting natural connections back into the environment. Others, logical ones like reducing the other stresses on ecosystems to avoid negative synergies. There's a big energy agenda here. It's a very serious energy agenda, as we heard in the previous 2 talks. But it's not something that we cannot take on if we don't do it with real resolve. And one could also reduce the amount of emissions that actually come from tropical deforestation. And that's what a lot of the non-fossil fuel negotiations have been about over the past 20 years. But basically, we have an annual equation which we can try and manage. So major amount of CO2 from burning fossil fuels, maybe 20% from the burning of tropical forests, with about half going in the atmosphere, roughly 29% to land and 26% to the oceans. Question is there a way to change some of those amounts and some of the direction of those arrows? So the big challenge, of course, is that greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time. And it actually takes a while before a certain concentration of greenhouse gases actually traps enough radiant heat to raise the Earth's temperature. So one arrives at the conclusion that it would be really desirable to reduce the amount of excess CO2 in the atmosphere. And there are 2 ways to do it. One is biological, and the other is not biological. So twice in the history of life on Earth, there have been extremely high concentrations of CO2 brought down to pre-industrial levels basically by biological processes. The first time it happened with the emergence of plants on land. The second time it happened was with the arrival of modern flowering plants doing all of this more efficiently. And there's also an important component of soil biodiversity and soil formation involved in those drawdowns. Our problem is we don't have tens of millions of years to make this happen. But as it turns out, a significant portion of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere actually comes from 3 centuries of destruction and degradation of ecosystems. And a significant portion of that can come back. So this is a somewhat hypothetical diagram about all of this. The only real numbers on it are those on the left. 280 parts per million was pre-industrial. 350 is what we're talking about as safer. And 390 was the level in the atmosphere at the time this diagram was drawn. It's now closer to 400. So the REDD is the UN acronym for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. But the big green portion of this graph represents the potential of drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere and bringing down CO2 levels to something closer to that safer level. So that involves probably 50 parts per million that could be done over 50 years. You could actually do it faster if you wanted to invest more money. It involves restoration of forests and managing forests in ways to maximize their carbon. It involves managing grasslands and grazing lands, restoring them. And what do you get when you do that? You get better grazing. And it also involves modifying agricultural systems so they begin to store carbon in the soil instead of leak it the way most modern industrialized agriculture does. So basically over a 50-year period, one could pull 50 parts per million out of the atmosphere. That's roughly equal to half a degree of temperature that increase that the Earth would be spared. So you have to do all of that, of course, in a world with 2 billion more people. They will have to be fed. We're going to have very sophisticated, integrated planning about how we use the surface of the Earth, both to manage the Earth's climate and to benefit people in the various ways we've heard from the previous 2 prize winners. So in the end, the point I want to make is our blue planet is also a green planet. And we literally can use the living planet to regreen the emerald planet, use the living planet to make the planet more habitable. Thank you very much.